In a moment, we're going to talk about scene investigation. Prior to that, I'd like to speak to the aspect of responding to a domestic violence call. Officers are reminded that domestic violence situations are very unpredictable, and in your response to that domestic violence call, you have to keep that in the forefront of your thinking. The offender very possibly knows that you are responding to this call, which increases the possibility for ambush. Remember your deployment. Remember your officer safety skills. If you don't arrive at that scene in one piece and secure, then we don't have a chance of helping anyone.
Officer safety is a priority as you respond to the scene. You don't want to announce your presence, obviously, by having lights and sirens. You want to park some distance away so you can have time to stop and listen. I mean, sometimes hearing what's going on, hearing the conversations, whether they're loud, there may be other noises, people being thrown around, glass breaking. In the worst case scenario, shots fired. That would kind of give you a precursor as to what you're walking into. And I think most officers are aware of that. I mean, that's standard, drilled into you from your academy days. In domestic violence, being a kind of call that often results in violence against officers, and it's one of our primary officer safety concerns, is I think most officers are aware of that component. The component of victim safety sometimes isn't always that obvious.
You know, we're trained, you get to the house, neighbor's standing there, ask the neighbor, did you call? Yeah. Why? What'd you hear? And then ease your way up to the house to see if you hear what's going on in the house. Majority of them carry a little pocket recorder. Record it. Record the conversations. Because while you're talking to your victim, your defendant may be in there yelling something to you or at the other officers that you can piece it all together for the victim.
Knowing that if the offender is a substance abuser or using alcohol recently can be a big threat factor. In some cases, some of the stimulant-type drugs, cocaine and methamphetamine, can actually cause violence and cause paranoia that may, result in an attack on the officer. The days of, if this happens again, we're going to come back and do something, can't exist anymore. We can't treat this as a matter where just putting them in separate rooms or having somebody leave to cool off for a while and then come back later. It's proved to be very detrimental to the situation in that particular family. I think what officers have to realize is that this is a crime and you do have a victim.
Law enforcement officers should be trained that when they go into a scene where there's domestic abuse, they're under a mandate to determine whether there's probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed, and then determine the primary predominant aggressor and arrest if appropriate.
Who appears to be in the greatest amount of fear and who has suffered the greatest level of injury, physical and emotional, from the experience.
It's not uncommon for offenders to try to manipulate what has happened. They may be the first ones to have called the police because they know that it's usually the caller that the officers will assume is the victim in the case or the one that's bringing it to police attention. And they know how to manipulate that system. And so by calling the police and telling that the wife, portraying the wife in those cases as the primary aggressor may be inaccurate. In some cases they may even have marks on them that were, in reality, they were really defensive, or marks where the person was trying to protect themselves and in turn scratch the true offender, but the offender is trying to make themselves look like the victim. So the officer really has to ask some other questions and get an assessment of what has happened in those previous instances.
And the sad part about it, out of the majority of them, there's going to be a small child there. And that small child is going to be able to tell you what happened.
Interviewing the children in an age-appropriate way can, in my experience, glean useful information about what happened, because you may still have a victim who's trying to minimize. You have a victim who loves the person she's in a relationship with. This isn't a stranger who walked up to the street and hit her.
Is there a restraining order in effect? Have there been previous calls of domestic violence? Again, going back, are there weapons present? Sometimes you can almost sense fear in the victims, but they're not saying things. They're not being obvious. They're not telling what's happened. That may be the indication that there's something else going on. They may be very, very fearful because they've been threatened by the offender, they've lived in this situation, they've been accustomed to it, that they're not willing to tell the officers up front what's going on. So the officers have to draw that out based on observations and the direct line of questioning that leads to a complete assessment. To give you some examples, one of the first things you would do is look at the condition of the residence. Are there fresh holes in the wall? Are there tables turned over? Is the place in disarray?
But if it's not detailed in that report, and if it's not in that report, it didn't happen. Because that defense attorney is looking to see what occurred. And if you don't put it in that report, it didn't happen.
But officers have a real tendency not to place what they see on the paper in front of them. So actually visualize exactly what you're looking at, take a picture of it, but put it on the paper. So, because the only thing that we see here in the courts are what you write down. And so we really don't get an actual a visual effect, basically, of what you're looking at out there.
Are there injuries, torn clothing, other kind of signs that would show that there's possibly been some violence or some type of struggle involving the two people? These are just preliminary observations, obviously, but they would kind of give you an idea that now as you go into the line of questioning, who's being more credible and who may be the victim and who may actually be the abuser in these situations. And I'm just kind of repeating what he's saying in his own words. And even when I summarize what I'm saying, if I am wrong in my assumption, he'll tell me I'm wrong. But it encourages that communication, and I think that a lot of officers go in there with just the facts, just give me the facts.
One of the things that police officers can do is to ask open-ended questions and then allow the story to emerge. When people are traumatized, sometimes their story doesn't come out in a point A, point B, point C fashion. Sometimes it's jumbled together, and so if they can take the time to allow that to emerge and ask questions where they're confused, help me understand what happened.
So officers have to realize this is a big responsibility. This is probably one of the most serious calls that impact on everything we do in law enforcement, because those people that are affected by it could, we could find them later on as drug users, burglars, they could be murderers themselves. And worst case scenario, most likely they're going to end up be future abusers that other law enforcement officers are going to have to deal with. So if officers take their job seriously and look at that and their role in that case and truly be an advocate for the victim, they can see themselves as an agent for change for the future and making a difference.